Psychological continuity and fission. What's fission? Well, imagine this scenario. It's kind of a futuristic scenario, I guess. So here's Ahmed, and unfortunately Ahmed has a real problem with various parts of his body. And what happens to people like Ahmed in the future is very simple. They have a body donor, someone who no longer needs their body because they've entered a kind of virtual phase of their lives, and the body donor hands over the body, and the brain of Ahmed is translated? No, it's not translated. It's transferred to the new body. So this is how it happens. And in Ahmed's case, actually, it's the body of a woman, and so he decides to become trans, and he becomes Beatrice. But the thing about the brain transfer operation is that it's a little bit risky. And people really, they have two brain hemispheres, just need one. So the safe thing to do here is to take half the brain of Ahmed, transfer it into the donor body, and just see what happens, right? And you've still got half a brain in reserve, just in case. Now, Ahmed's kind of a wealthy guy, so what he does is actually shortcuts the process and takes each brain hemisphere and have it transplanted into two different bodies simultaneously, because, he figures he just wants to be on the safe side. But as it happens, both of those brain transplants work beautifully. So now there are two people, Beatrice and Caitlin. The other one was also a woman, right? So here we go. Ahmed born a man, he's become a woman. He's become two women. Wait a minute, that's confusing. How can one person become two? Well, that's fission, right? That's fission for you. Now, on the face of it, this is a perfectly coherent story. Ahmed started off as a single person. He underwent some fission, and he became two people. Doesn't seem particularly complex or confusing. Well, it's probably confusing for people who knew Ahmed before, but for us standing back looking at it theoretically, it's fine. Now, note the really important thing. Beatrice is not identical to Caitlin. These are clearly two distinct people. They have two separate lives. They live in two different parts of town. They actually don't like each other. They did date for a while, but that was weird. They fell out. They broke up. Couldn't work out who would do the dishes. These are definitely distinct people, right? You can't really fight with somebody who is yourself. Not very easily anyway. I've tried it. It doesn't end well. Beatrice and Caitlin, clearly distinct people. Now, if we're thinking about numerical identity, we know that Beatrice is not identical to Caitlin. It follows from that we can't maintain both that Ahmed is identical to Beatrice and that Ahmed is identical to Caitlin. But since the case is so symmetrical, it seems like if we reject Ahmed is identical to Beatrice or Ahmed is identical to Caitlin, we should reject both of those. Right? There can be no reason, by the way the case is constructed, for accepting one of those and rejecting the others. It follows then that since Beatrice and Caitlin are distinct individuals, numerically distinct, Beatrice and Ahmed are numerically distinct, and Caitlin and Ahmed are numerically distinct as well. So why is this interesting to us? Well, let me just show you something that's clearly closely related. We know that Beatrice and Caitlin are not numerically identical. They're clearly distinct people. But because of this brain transplant stuff, we also know that Ahmed is psychologically continuous with Beatrice and with Caitlin. If we add in the psychological continuity view of personal identity, I'm sure you remember that. That says, roughly speaking, that if you've got a person at a time and a thing at a time, and the thing remembers events which were experienced by the person, or conversely, then the person and the thing are identical. If we put those four things together, we get an inconsistent quartet. Now, what I want you to do is to turn to the personal people that you are with when you're watching this video, if there are any. If not, you're going to have to think much better if there's other people. Take 90 seconds and just try to explain to each other as clearly as you can why this quartet is inconsistent. Explain why the quartet is inconsistent as clearly as you can. Go. Remember, psychological continuity views about personal identity. According to those views, if we accept that those are true, then we're saying that if you have a person at one time and a thing at another time, and the thing has memories concerning events which the person experienced, underwent, then the two are identical. The person is the thing. That means that from the fact that Ahmed is psychologically continuous with Beatrice, that's what the brain transplant thing did for us, together with the psychological continuity view, we can infer that Ahmed is Beatrice. And likewise, we can infer that Ahmed is Caitlin. But now, of course, we've got a contradiction. We've got an inconsistent quartet. We cannot maintain all four claims. It looks on the face of it, then, that we have to reject the psychological continuity view, since the first three claims, on the face of it, are all true. So where is this long discussion taken us? Very simple. If fission is possible, if Ahmed can be psychologically continuous with two distinct people, Beatrice and Caitlin, then the psychological continuity view of personal identity must be false. But is fission really possible? Well, I think we can show pretty convincingly that it is. Here's the thought. The removal of one brain hemisphere would not break psychological continuity, right? So you could have an operation where part of your brain was removed, even half of it, wouldn't change you. You might also have an identical twin whose brain had been removed. Your brain could be transplanted into the identical twin's body, into that debrained body. Nothing impossible there. Very difficult to do beyond current medical practice, but as far as metaphysics go, this is clearly possible. Successfully transplanting your brain into your twin's body would ensure psychological continuity. Yes, it would be upsetting. Yes, there would be some changes to you, but there would be some things that were continuous psychologically before and after the operation. The removal and destruction of a brain hemisphere, followed by the transplant of the other hemisphere, would ensure psychological continuity. Right. That's pretty clear. That follows from the things that we've said already. All of that, I think, should be pretty straightforward, uncontroversial from a metaphysical point of view. Right? Medically, there are some questions, but metaphysically, we're fine. It follows just from those claims that you could be psychologically continuous with two distinct people, metaphysically speaking. So it seems very clear that psychological fission is possible. That tells us, of course, that the psychological continuity view of personal identity must be false. How do people react to this news? Now that's really interesting. Do you remember when we were thinking about biological continuity? Then we came up with an inconsistent triad, and one response, proposed by Olson, was to reject the idea that identity went with moral responsibility. It turns out that proponents of psychological continuity have a complementary move. This is a really interesting fact. What the proponents of psychological continuity sometimes say is, look, the identity relation is just not what matters in survival. Instead, what matters, this is Shoemaker, proponent of psychological continuity view, what matters has to consist in psychological continuity and or psychological connectedness. As long as the relations of psychological continuity hold between me now and some other thing in the future, regardless of whether or not it holds one-to-one, what happens is just as good as ordinary survival. So what is Shoemaker suggesting here? What Shoemaker's suggesting is that psychological continuity views are not really views about identity at all. The topic is not personal identity, it's personal survival. In the sense that matters, and I suppose this means kind of ethically and for practical purposes, psychological continuity is what ensures survival. So Shoemaker calls this the identity doesn't matter view. So it's very neat. Now we've seen a kind of division between proponents of biological continuity and proponents of psychological continuity. Proponents of biological continuity will tell you that identity is a matter of biology, and identity doesn't matter from the point of view of moral responsibility. Compatibly with that, proponents of psychological continuity will tell you that psychological continuity doesn't tell you anything about numerical identity, but it is what matters from a moral point of view, and it is what matters for ordinary thinking about personal survival. So strangely, in philosophy, we seem to have reached a point where there is actually quite broad agreement about personal identity.